photos are released about evidence discovered in the Jessica Dishon murder investigation. Prosecutors believe this evidence, a sheet found in a Bullitt County barn, will lead to the conviction of 55-year-old Stanley Dishon for his niece's murder.
In a hallway outside a courtroom in Bullitt County, Kentucky, a sheriff put his head in his hands and cried. He was not a young man anymore. He had gray in his hair and 20 years of small-town law enforcement behind him. And men like that do not usually cry in front of cameras. But on this day, in the year 2013, Sheriff David Greenwell could not help it. A grand jury had just handed up an indictment in the death of a girl named Jessica Dishon. It had taken 14 years. It had taken the collapse of one prosecution, the ruin of an innocent man's reputation, and the quiet unraveling of an entire family before anyone found the truth. And the man now in handcuffs wasn't a stranger. He was Jessica's uncle. He had searched for her. He had cried with her father in the woods. For a decade and a half, he had sat across the table from the people who loved her and said nothing. David Greenwell had a reason to weep that went beyond the case itself. 14 years earlier, he had been a rookie sheriff's deputy, the only person in the department willing to believe a grieving mother when she said her daughter would never simply run away. Nobody had listened to him then. Now he was the sheriff, and it was his name on the arrest. In Shepherdsville, people did not forget Jessica Dishon in the years the case sat unsolved. Her photograph stayed pinned to bulletin boards in gas stations and grocery stores long after the leads had dried up. Every anniversary of her disappearance, the local paper ran another update, another quote from her parents, another reminder that whoever had taken her was, as far as anyone could prove, still walking around free. Nobody in that county, not the family, not the sheriff's department, not the neighbor who had once been charged and cleared, ever really got to put the case down. It sat over Bullitt County for 15 years, like weather that refused to pass. This is the story of how it finally did. Jessica Dawn Dishon was born on the 2nd of May, 1982, to Michael and Edna Dishon. She grew up in Shepherdsville, a small farming town in Bullitt County, Kentucky, about 20 miles south of Louisville, the kind of place where everyone's family tree tangles into everyone else's, where a body of water called the River Bottoms carried its own local reputation, a stretch of woods and current along the Salt River that people spoke of, the way small towns speak of places bad things are rumored to happen. Jessica lived there with her parents and her 2 younger brothers, Mike Jr., whom the family called Bubba, and Chris. She was, by every account her friends and teachers gave, a responsible girl. Good grades, steady. The kind of teenager other parents held up as an example. She had her sights set on becoming an accountant, and she had already started making the small declarations of independence that 17-year-olds make. She had bought herself a red Pontiac Sunfire with her own money, and she had a new boyfriend nobody in her family had quite met yet. Her senior year at Bullitt Central High School was supposed to be the year everything opened up for her. College applications, a part-time job, maybe. The slow, ordinary work of becoming an adult. She was also close to her family, closer than most teenagers her age. Neighbors would later remember her as the kind of girl who still hugged her mother goodbye, who still wanted her father's approval, who had not yet pulled away in the manner teenagers often do. That closeness would make what came next unbearable for the people who loved her, and it would turn out to be the very thing her killer could not tolerate. On the morning of September 10th, 1999, Jessica left for school in her new car. She never got there. Her mother, Edna, came home a little after 1 in the afternoon and saw the red Sunfire sitting in the driveway. It made no sense. Jessica should have been in class until 2:30. Edna walked over, looked inside, and felt the first cold drop of dread. No Jessica. She called Michael. He was just as confused. Edna went back to the car and looked more carefully this time. Jessica's purse was there. Her backpack was there. One of her shoes was there. Her cell phone sat on the passenger seat. The car keys were on the floor, not in the ignition, and when Edna turned them, the engine caught immediately. Nothing was wrong with the car. Something was wrong with everything else. She called the school. Jessica had never arrived. By now, Edna was calling everyone she could think of. Jessica's friends, her boyfriend, anyone who might know something, anything. Nobody had seen her since the day before. Every answer came back the same. No. Michael raced home. When he picked up the cell phone from the passenger seat, he noticed something that turned his stomach. The numbers 9 and 1 had already been entered into the keypad. His daughter had been dialing 911. Someone, or something, had stopped her before she finished. That afternoon, Edna and Michael drove to the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department to report their daughter missing. Only one person in that building took them seriously. His name was David Greenwell, a young deputy still new enough to the job that his opinion did not carry much weight with the senior detectives around him. Greenwell looked at what the Dishons described: the purse, the shoe, the unfinished emergency call, and he did not believe for 1 second that this was a runaway. His superiors disagreed. They told the family that teenagers leave. They told them she would probably turn up. Greenwell did not accept that. The next day, on his own initiative, he went out to process the scene, because nobody senior to him thought it was worth the trouble. He did the best he could with what he had, which was not enough. He worked without gloves. He did not, and in fairness could not, keep the scene sealed the way a homicide scene needs to be sealed, because as far as his own department was concerned, there was no homicide. Family members touched the car. Friends touched the car. Reporters touched the car. By the time anyone in a position of real authority accepted that something criminal had happened here, the physical evidence around Jessica's own vehicle, the single most important piece of the case, had been contaminated beyond meaningful use. With the department slow to move, Shepherdsville did what small towns do. The community organized. Neighbors and family walked the fields and the woods in long, uneven lines, calling Jessica's name, checking ditches and barns, and the tangled brush along the river. People who had never met Jessica Dishon gave up their weekends to look for her, because in a town that size, everyone's daughter is a little bit everyone's daughter. Michael's brother, Stanley Dishon, was among the searchers, an uncle who had stayed close to Michael's family over the years, welcomed in and out of the house, a familiar face at the dinner table, someone the children had grown up calling uncle without a second thought. During one search along the river bottoms, Stanley became violently sick and had to be walked home. At the time, nobody thought twice about it. A man vomiting from grief and heat while searching for his missing niece was, if anything, a sign of how much this family was suffering together. Only years later would anyone understand what that sickness might really have been, and how close, on that particular afternoon, the search party had come to finding her. A few days into the search, Jessica's younger brother Chris came running into the house, certain he had heard his sister screaming for help somewhere outside. Michael grabbed his gun and ran into the dark with Stanley close behind him. On a hill near the house, they saw firelight. When they got closer, they found their neighbor, a man named David "Bucky" Brooks, burning something in a barrel. Michael did not like what he saw. He asked Brooks if he could search his property as part of the ongoing civilian search effort. Brooks said no. Michael called the sheriff's department, and law enforcement asked Brooks the same question. He refused them too, which meant deputies had to go and obtain a warrant before they could set foot on his land. When they finally did, a scent dog led them to a farm building where a pair of work gloves, carrying an unusual odor, was found tucked under a cushion. A search of Brooks's work van turned up a length of rope. It looked, on paper, like the beginning of a confession waiting to happen. It was not enough, yet, to arrest anyone. The Dishon family's patience with local law enforcement finally broke. They reached out to the FBI, and once federal agents became involved, the case's profile, and the urgency around it, changed almost overnight. Local officers who had spent 2 weeks treating Jessica as a probable runaway suddenly found themselves fielding calls from federal investigators asking pointed questions about their own handling of the scene. An $18,000 reward went up for information leading to Jessica or whoever had taken her. Investigators finally turned serious attention to Jessica's car, though by then, the damage from those first uncontrolled days could not be undone. What they could still see, despite the contamination, was a sign of struggle near the driver's side door. It was enough for the FBI to build a working theory. Jessica had been pulled from her car while trying to call for help, losing a shoe and her footing in the process, by someone she likely knew. When agents went back to Bucky Brooks's farm with fresh eyes, they found something else. A small printed school photograph of Jessica sitting on his property. To investigators chasing their only real lead, it looked damning. But a photograph and a bad alibi were not a body, and they were not a confession. And without either of those, they still could not charge him. 17 days after Jessica disappeared, on September 27, 1999, a bus driver named Karen Hobbs was working her regular route through the river bottoms when she saw something resting against a tree that did not belong there. She called 911. What police found in that heavily wooded stretch along the Salt River, 7 miles from the Dishon home, was a young woman positioned against a tree trunk, in a state that made clear she had been deceased for several days. Nearby lay a length of rope streaked with silver, red, and gray paint. Evidence investigators believed had been used to transport her from another location. Roughly 15 feet away, investigators recovered additional physical evidence, suggesting this was not where the crime had taken place, but where she had ultimately been left. Visual identification was not possible. It would take a tattoo, a class ring, a necklace, and eventually dental records to confirm what the Dishon family had already, in their hearts, known for more than 2 weeks. It was Jessica. When the sheriff's department arrived at the Dishon home to deliver the news, Edna's response wasn't disbelief. It was something closer to fury, aimed squarely at the institution that had wasted so many of those first critical hours. "Are you now going to tell me she's just a runaway?" she asked them. Michael could not bring himself to go and identify his daughter's body. Edna went in his place. The post-mortem examination filled in the outline of what had happened to her. Jessica had likely been kept alive for roughly 3 days after she was taken before her life ended. Forensic reports confirmed she had suffered severe injuries that ultimately took her life. With a body and a growing case file, all of the department's remaining attention turned to Bucky Brooks. He was 40 years old, a man who worked his family's farm, and he had already given investigators 2 different accounts of his own morning. First, that he'd seen Jessica walking toward school. Later, that he had been in bed with his wife the whole time. His wife denied it. Multiple witnesses said they had seen his van on the road near where Jessica's body would eventually be found in the days leading up to its discovery. As his story kept shifting, the FBI put him through a series of polygraph tests. He failed 4 of 6. The other 2 came back inconclusive. Nobody investigating Bucky Brooks in the year 2000 knew or thought to ask what his IQ was. It was 61, low enough to meet the legal threshold for intellectual disability, low enough that a standard police polygraph, built on a suspect's capacity to understand and process complicated, adversarial questioning, may never have been a fair test to give him at all. A frightened, cognitively vulnerable man, questioned again and again by people convinced he was guilty, will often say whatever seems most likely to end the questioning, will contradict himself, will agree with a version of events simply because the questioner keeps pushing toward it, not because it's true. Nobody paused to consider that in 1999, investigators saw a suspicious man who kept changing his story. And in their eyes, a shifting story could mean only one thing. They had their suspect, and 16 months after Jessica vanished, David "Bucky" Brooks was charged with the most serious offense the state could bring, a charge that at the time carried the possibility of a death sentence. For Brooks and his wife, the years that followed the charge were, by any measure, a kind of slow public execution of their old life. Neighbors who had known them for years began crossing the street rather than stop and talk. His attorney, John Spainhauer Jr., would later describe a man whose entire identity in Bullitt County had been reduced, almost overnight, to a single accusation, one that had not yet been tested in a courtroom and would not be for years. His trial opened in January of 2003. Prosecutors intended to seek the death penalty. For the Dishon family, watching Brooks stand trial felt, finally, like the beginning of justice. They had waited more than 3 years to sit in a courtroom and hear someone answer for what had happened to Jessica. Whatever complicated feelings they carried about the case's slow, mishandled start, the sight of a named defendant at a defense table must have felt, for a moment, like solid ground. It fell apart almost immediately. Detective Charlie Mann, testifying for the prosecution, mentioned Brooks's failed polygraph results on the stand, testimony that is inadmissible in Kentucky courts and everywhere else in the country, because polygraph results are considered too scientifically unreliable to be trusted by a jury. It was, by any measure, a basic and avoidable error, the kind of mistake that should never reach a jury's ears in a case this serious. The judge declared a mistrial. By September of that year, prosecutors admitted they did not have enough evidence to retry him and secure a conviction. The charges were dropped, and Bucky Brooks walked out of the courthouse a free man, but not in the eyes of a town that had spent years hearing his name attached to a little girl's death, a fully cleared one. Suspicion does not dissolve the moment a charge does. For the next decade, Brooks would live under a cloud that had never actually been earned. Jessica Dishon's case went cold. It would stay that way for the next decade. David Greenwell did not leave law enforcement after his department's early mistakes were exposed. If anything, the case seemed to sharpen something in him. Over the years that followed, he rose through the ranks of the same sheriff's department that had once brushed past his warnings, until by the early 2010s, he was Bullitt County's sheriff himself, the man now responsible for every unsolved file his younger self had once been powerless to push forward. Colleagues would later describe him as a man who never fully let the Dishon case go, who kept half an eye on it, even as newer cases piled onto his desk. It was, in some ways, the case that had made him. It seemed only fitting, in hindsight, that it would also be the case that came back to find him. The years between the mistrial and the break, though, were not kind to anyone who had loved Jessica. They broke the Dishon family in ways that had nothing to do with any courtroom. Edna and Michael, who had clung to each other through the search and the identification and the trial, could not survive what came after. The grief and the mistrial and the sense that whoever had really done this was still out there somewhere, living a normal life, maybe still close by, put a weight on their marriage that eventually became too much. They separated. Michael stayed in the family home. He left Jessica's bedroom exactly as she had left it on the morning of September 10th, 1999. Her bed stayed made. Her things stayed where she had put them. For 15 years, nobody touched a thing in that room. In Shepherdsville, Detective Lynn Hunt worked cold cases. When a colleague reached out and asked her to take a fresh look at the Dishon file, She agreed, and what she found when she opened it told her everything she needed to know about why it had never been solved. The file was thin. It was disorganized. Evidence that should have been carefully logged and preserved had been handled by half the town before anyone treated the case as a homicide. Hunt decided the only way forward was to start over, from the beginning, as if nothing in the file could be trusted. She visited Michael Dishon and asked to see Jessica's room. He showed her exactly what he had preserved: a bedroom frozen at the moment his daughter's life had been interrupted, still holding her comforter and bed sheets on the bed where she'd left them 15 years before. Posters still on the walls, nothing rearranged, nothing donated, nothing packed away in the ordinary process families use to make grief livable. Michael had simply closed the door on the morning of September 10th, 1999, and, for the most part, never reopened it in the way other rooms in the house got reopened. Hunt would later say that stepping into that room felt like stepping backward through time. A house that had otherwise kept moving, wrapped around one room that never had. Hunt also went back through old records connected to Bucky Brooks's case, and there she found something that had apparently gone unexamined at the time. Documentation of his intellectual disability, the same 61 IQ score that should have raised serious questions about the polygraph results used to build the entire case against him. It was a quiet but damning discovery. The man who had spent years living under the cloud of the most serious charge in the criminal code had likely been failing tests. He never had the cognitive capacity to properly understand in the first place. On September 30th, 2013, the case broke open. Not through forensic science, but through a phone call. An inmate at the Kentucky State Penitentiary contacted Detective Hunt and told her he had shared a cell with a man who had confessed in detail to being responsible for Jessica Dishon's death. The inmate described a man who said he had held Jessica captive for a few days before taking her life, and who had altered the scene afterward in an attempt to make her death look like the work of drug dealers or some kind of organized violence, rather than what it actually was. He said the killer had been enraged that Jessica had started seeing a boy her own age. Hunt listened carefully. The details lined up, in ways that were hard to explain away, with facts from the original 1999 post-mortem findings, facts that had never been made public. A second inmate, independently, came forward with the same account and the same name. The name both men gave her was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, the same man who had joined the searches in 1999, the same man who had gotten violently sick along the river bottoms and had to be taken home, half a mile, it would turn out, from the exact spot where Jessica was eventually found. For a detective who had spent months sifting through a file built almost entirely on someone else's mistakes, it was the first genuinely solid lead the case had produced in 14 years. And it pointed not at a stranger with a bad alibi, but at a man who had sat at the Dishon family's table more times than anyone could count. Hunt and Jessica's brother went out together to an abandoned barn on Greenwell Ford Road, a structure investigators had never fully searched during the original case. It was, by every description, a grim place. Dirt floors, rotting timber, the accumulated debris of years of neglect. They worked through it methodically, pulling back layers of rubbish that had clearly sat undisturbed since long before the search for it had even begun. Then, buried under all of it, they found a decayed bedsheet. Jessica's brother recognized it instantly. It looked exactly like the bedding still sitting, untouched, on his sister's bed at home. Hunt would later describe the moment plainly. She turned to him, sheet in hand, and said it looked just like his sister's. And he told her he couldn't be sure because he hadn't set foot in that room in years. When Hunt and the family compared it to what was still on Jessica's bed, in the room Michael had never let anyone move a single object in, the comforter and pillow cover matched. The same bedding that had covered Jessica as a child had, a decade and a half earlier, been used to wrap her and carry her away from the house where she'd slept under it every night of her life. When investigators finally sat Stanley Dishon down and laid out what they had, the bed sheet, the barn, the timeline, the two inmates telling the same story from two different cells, he did not break the way television has taught people to expect a guilty man to break. He denied it flatly. He denied driving to his brother's house that morning. He denied any argument, any struggle, any trip to the river bottoms. Investigators pressed him on the details only the killer could have known, the same details the informants had already handed Detective Hunt weeks earlier, and watched him deny each one in turn, calmly, almost bored, as though the accusation belonged to somebody else's life. Confronted, Stanley Dishon refused to confess. But the case against him no longer needed a confession to move forward. Investigators discovered a long, previously hidden history of serious intrafamilial crimes involving multiple young relatives across several decades, some of whom had been young girls welcomed into his home over the years, given a place to live, and repaid, as one relative would later put it in court, with harm instead of gratitude. At the time of the 2013 indictment, Stanley Dishon was already behind bars, serving out a sentence he had received in 2005 for a serious offense against a family member. He had served 8 years and 8 months and was due for release on September 6, 2013, days before his arrest, when he was instead re-indicted on additional felony charges involving a young family member dating back to 1982. It was against that backdrop, on a Wednesday in August of 2013, that Sheriff David Greenwell, the same rookie deputy who had once been the only person in his own department willing to believe Jessica's parents, announced the indictment of 55-year-old Stanley Dishon for the death and kidnapping of his niece. Greenwell did not hide his emotion at the press conference. 14 years of frustration came out at once, and he did something else that day that mattered nearly as much as the arrest itself. He formally, publicly, and without hesitation, cleared David "Bucky" Brooks of any connection to Jessica's death. As far as I'm concerned, Greenwell told reporters, we indicted the wrong person. I don't look at Brooks as a suspect in any way. For Bucky Brooks, who had spent a decade carrying the suspicion of an entire community for something he had nothing to do with, it was, according to his attorney, a genuine relief. It did not undo what those years had cost him, but it put his name, finally, on the right side of the case's history. What investigators eventually pieced together, through the informants, the physical evidence, and Stanley Dishon's own history, was this account of that morning, one that finally made sense of a mystery the family had carried for a decade and a half. On the morning of September 10th, 1999, after Michael and the rest of the household had already left for the day, Stanley had gone to his brother's house and waited. He had been harming Jessica for years by that point, quietly, inside the trust of a family that had no reason to suspect him. That morning, something set him off. Investigators believe it was Jessica's new boyfriend, and the fear, sharpened by how close she was to her family, that she was finally ready to tell someone the truth about what her uncle had done to her. When Jessica walked out to her car to leave for school, Stanley confronted her. She tried to call for help. He pulled her from the car, knocking loose her shoe in the struggle and scattering her belongings across the seat. When she attempted to escape toward the house, he overpowered her, inflicting severe physical injuries before she could reach safety. He wrapped her, unconscious or barely conscious, in the bedsheet from her own room, remade the bed behind him so nothing would look disturbed, and carried her off to the abandoned barn, where he would keep her for the next 3 days. There, according to the account he reportedly gave a fellow inmate years later, he harmed her further, and before long, she did not survive. Afterward, he altered the scene, injuring her remains in an effort to disguise what had actually happened as something else entirely. Something that could be blamed on strangers, on drugs, on anyone but a member of her own family. He drove her out to the river bottoms and left her there, seated against a tree, to be found by whoever eventually came across her. He then went home, and in the days that followed, joined the search for the niece, whose life he had already taken. He walked those same woods with his brother, calling her name along with everyone else. He stood beside Michael as reporters gathered outside the house. He got sick near the very spot where she would be found 17 days later, and let his family believe it was grief. For a decade and a half, he sat at family gatherings, attended the same holidays, remained, as far as anyone around him could tell, exactly the uncle he had always been. Stanley Dishon's trial never happened in the way the Dishon family had originally hoped for. In January of 2015, he entered what is known as an unanswered plea, a legal arrangement in which a defendant does not admit guilt, but acknowledges that the state has enough evidence to convict him at trial. He entered that plea to first-degree manslaughter in Jessica's death, along with several other charges connected to the family members he had harmed over the years. A separate kidnapping charge, tied to how she had been held in the barn, was dismissed as part of the arrangement. Prosecutors chose not to pursue the death penalty. His defense attorney, Jennifer Whitmire, was blunt about the calculation behind the deal. Facing the underlying felony charges alone, she said, Stanley Dishon was already looking at a life sentence. By pleading to those counts along with manslaughter, he capped his total exposure at 20 years, with the possibility of parole after roughly 16. Had it just been Jessica's case, she told reporters at the time, we would have gone to trial, no problem. It was a telling admission from Dishon's own lawyer that the abuse charges alone, not the case involving his niece, were what finally forced her client's hand. She insisted, and would keep insisting for years afterward, that her client was not responsible for what happened to his niece, and that whoever was, in her words, still out there. It was a claim the physical evidence, the matching bedsheet, and 2 independently corroborating jailhouse informants made increasingly difficult for anyone outside Dishon's own defense team to take seriously. Stanley Dishon was formally sentenced on March 26, 2015, in a Bullitt County courtroom before Special Judge Charles Sims III. He showed almost no emotion as the sentence was read. 20 years, on all charges combined, running concurrently. Parole eligibility after roughly 16. 5 years of probation once he was released. Mandatory registration as a sex offender for the rest of his life. Jessica's parents were in that courtroom, sitting, as they had for so many hearings across so many years, in the same hard wooden benches, waiting once again for something that might feel like an answer. Michael Dishon, who had once grabbed his own gun and run into the dark searching for his daughter, alongside the man responsible for her death, addressed the court directly. It took about 17 years of my life away from me, he said, when he killed my daughter. I want to see him hang. There was no theater in the way he said it. It was simply, after everything, the truest thing he had left to say. Edna, who by then had remarried and was known as Edna Dishon Jett, told reporters afterward that there was a hole in her heart that would never be filled, that a family member had taken from her The chance of ever knowing what Jessica's future, her career, her own children, the life she had been building toward, might have looked like. She spoke of grandchildren she would now never have, a whole branch of the family's future that had simply been cut away. She said there was no word strong enough for what he had done, and that 20 years did not feel like enough. But she also understood the way exhausted, grieving people sometimes have to understand, why the prosecution had taken the deal rather than risk a jury trial and the chance of losing everything. Another victim spoke at that same sentencing, a relative who had been targeted decades before Jessica was born. She told the court she was confused, that she had been through hell, that his silence in that courtroom, his refusal to explain even now why he had done any of it, was its own kind of cruelty. Others who had been abused by him as children gave statements of their own, describing a pattern that stretched back across generations of the same family. Girls taken in, trusted, and hurt, one after another, by a man everyone else had also trusted. Special Judge Charles Sims listened to all of it without offering the family the thing they wanted most. There were, in the end, no real answers about why. Stanley Dishon sat through the hearing largely without expression, and when it was over, nobody in that courtroom understood him any better than they had going in. Stanley Dishon did not stay silent forever. In 2019, from the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville, he gave his first public interview since the sentencing, telling a reporter it was time he came forward and told the truth. He maintained, as he always had under the terms of his Alford plea, that he was not responsible for his niece's death. He said he had not seen her in months before her death. He said he had reached out to the Kentucky Innocence Project 2 years earlier, offering to take a polygraph and provide his DNA, only to be told the organization was not taking on his case. When asked about Jessica directly, he said simply that he hoped she had gone to heaven. Whatever Stanley Dishon says now, from behind the walls of a state penitentiary, the physical trail that led investigators to him has never pointed anywhere else. 2 inmates, independently, described details of Jessica's death that matched a 1999 forensic examination the public never saw. A decayed sheet, buried under years of dirt in an abandoned barn half a mile from where she was found, matched the bedding still sitting untouched on a 17-year-old girl's bed in a room her father could not bring himself to change for a decade and a half. And a rookie deputy who once stood alone in believing a mother's fear, who processed a crime scene by himself because no one senior to him thought it mattered, eventually rose to become the sheriff who closed the case, who cried in a hallway when the indictment finally came down, and who looked into a camera and told the public, plainly, that an innocent man had paid for someone else's crime. For Bucky Brooks, that public reckoning came in time to matter. He lived to hear his name cleared, and to spend his final years without the shadow of Jessica's death hanging over him, before he died of cardiac arrest at his home in 2021. For the Dishon family, there is no such clean ending. Edna and Michael never reconciled. Jessica's brothers grew into adulthood, carrying a grief that started before either of them had finished high school, watching their parents' marriage dissolve under the weight of a case that would not close, then watching it finally close in the worst possible way. Not with a stranger's face, but with an uncle's. The accountant Jessica wanted to become, the life she was quietly building toward in the fall of 1999, exists now only in the way her parents describe her. In the past tense, in courtrooms, in interviews given decades after the fact to keep her name from fading. And in Eddyville, in a cell not so different from the one where 2 informants first heard him confess, Stanley Dishon still tells anyone who will listen that he is an innocent man. There is a particular cruelty in how this case resolved itself, not through a breakthrough in forensic science, Not through some new piece of technology that finally caught up to an old crime, but through the plain, human stubbornness of the people who refused to let it go. A rookie deputy who believed a mother when nobody else would. A cold case detective willing to start an entire investigation over from nothing. A father who could not bring himself to move a single object in his daughter's room, not because he expected it to matter someday, but because he simply could not. And in the end, it did matter. It was the thing that mattered most. The bedsheet told a different story than the one Stanley Dishon spent 15 years letting his family believe. It always had. It just took a decade and a half, and a father who could not bring himself to change his daughter's bed, for anyone to finally listen to what it was saying.